US President Donald Trump's latest round of tariffs has shaken global markets. While countries like Canada say they are working to negotiate better trade deals, Trump is doubling down on tariffs as his chosen weapon to boost the US economy. But critics say his approach is reckless, unpredictable, and deeply personal. Prime Minister Mark Carney is trying his best to navigate the storm. Yet, as one Canadian official put it, this guy will say something one day, and then the cheese slips off the cracker, and suddenly he goes the other way. How do you deal with a man like this? It all began like a chess match. One Trump believed he had already won. He assumed Canada would soon give way under pressure, just as many smaller nations had done when the White House turned up the heat. It started with veiled warnings, escalated into harsh remarks in the media, and culminated in the threat that if Canada maintained its stance on Palestine, any trade deal could be halted. But Ottawa did not flinch. They held firm, patiently waiting for the right moment to strike back. And that moment arrived. Mark Carney, true to his quiet and steady character, shifted the balance, forcing Trump himself onto the defensive. Tariffs remained in place. Tensions between the two sides escalated further, and then, things unfolded in ways Trump had not anticipated. The deal he thought he would fully control suddenly slipped beyond his grasp. Was this merely a trade war? Or was it part of a far deeper battle of wits? And what does it reveal about the true balance of power between Canada and the United States? Trump launched his warning strike in a way no one saw coming. Just hours before new tariffs targeting Canada were set to take effect, he abruptly posted a midnight message on social media. In the combative style he was known for, no statement from the Oval Office, no formal diplomatic note, just a declaration aimed squarely at public opinion, insisting that Canada's position in support of Palestinian statehood would make any trade agreement nearly impossible to achieve. No backroom negotiations, no soft diplomacy, just a public blow meant to punish Canada for daring to defy him. And clearly, this was about much more than trade. Many allied nations shared Canada's view, yet none faced such harsh retaliation. France did not, the UK did not, Mexico did not, but Canada was singled out. What truly angered Trump was not the policy difference itself. What unsettled him was Canada's determination to act on its own terms. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney's leadership, Canadian foreign policy no longer waited for Washington's approval, and it was precisely that independence Trump could not tolerate. That steady, silent resolve exposed cracks in Trump's self-styled image as the deal-maker-in-chief. His response turned the trade negotiations into a stage for personal grievance. Yet Carney did not budge. No conciliatory phone call, no gesture to soothe the White House ego. Instead, Canada stood firmly by its principles. They acted on conviction, not on passing fits of anger. This only made Trump more impatient. Before the cameras, he repeatedly accused Canada of being unfair to American farmers. He threatened punishing tariffs, some exceeding 200%. And then, he dragged defense into the fray, reminding everyone that the United States was protecting Canada militarily, as if that entitled him to dictate Canadian economic policy. In his view, sovereignty seemed like a bargaining chip. But the reality on the ground was far more complex. Canada and the United States share one of the most stable and deeply integrated economic relationships on the planet. Tariffs, when applied, must rest on carefully negotiated agreements, not on a whim. Yet Trump's portrayal of Canada as an opportunist ignored decades of mutually beneficial cooperation. His attacks were never about fixing trade deficits, they were about manufacturing an enemy, and tragically, the villain this time was a democratic neighbor, bound to the United States by history, geography, and trade. Carney's calm determination and principled stance only underscored the stark contrast in leadership styles. When the President of the United States sowed unease with threats, Canada responded with steadiness, and with a clear commitment to its people. The message was delivered unambiguously. National sovereignty is not a commodity to be bargained away. Trump may have expected a softer reaction, but instead, he encountered a firm response, built on confidence and careful preparation. What stood out most was that his threats emerged at the very moment the US economy itself was beginning to falter. That week's jobs report disappointed. Numbers fell short of expectations, and earlier revisions quietly removed nearly 260,000 jobs from the official statistics. The battle was not only about tariffs, it was about credibility, leadership, and the shifting balance of power between Washington and Ottawa. Many economists were quick to point out a simple truth: the uncertainty created by Trump's tariff policies was discouraging businesses from expanding hiring. In other words, the trade war he had unleashed was circling back to undermine the American economy itself, rather than confront the underlying cause. Trump turned his criticism towards statisticians. He even accused them of falsifying data. When a head of state chooses to attack the messenger instead of facing the truth, it is not a sign of confidence, it is a mark of instability. Canada, watching all this unfold, saw the opportunity to reinforce its own development path. While Trump wielded tariffs as a political weapon, Ottawa set about building substance, investing heavily in domestic manufacturing, steel and aluminium, all powered by Canadian resources, Canadian labor, and Canadian expertise. More and more countries and businesses worldwide began expressing interest in strengthening trade ties with Canada. The reason was not only economic opportunity, but also the stability and predictability of Canada's approach. For Prime Minister Carney, the priority was never tit for tat with Trump, but ensuring Canada reduced its risks amid growing volatility in the United States, and from that one clear truth emerged. Real economic strength comes from maintaining autonomy. Canada is proving that it can thrive without being subject to Washington's shifting moods or fleeting whims. Each time Carney refused a disadvantageous deal, he reinforced the message: any agreement with Canada must respect the nation's sovereignty and core interests. This strategy is neither flashy nor needlessly confrontational. It is crafted with prudence, with deliberation, and with effectiveness. By contrast, Trump became entangled in political showmanship. Rather than maintaining true strategic control, he was not seeking mutually beneficial cooperation. He was trying to force Canada into a position of weakness. It mirrored the mindset he had long applied in business. Power lies in dominating the other party, not in building lasting relationships. Carney's steadfastness rendered that approach entirely ineffective. This confrontation is not only about policy, it is also a test of endurance. Trump bet on fatigue, assuming Canada would eventually yield after a barrage of relentless threats. But Carney placed his confidence in resilience. He understood that perseverance would outlast sudden, unpredictable bursts of anger, as Canadian officials have noted. To preserve national strength, sovereignty must be exercised and defended, just as muscles will wither if not used regularly. Holding firm was never about one temporary decision, it was about affirming Canada's long-term independence. And in reality, the bilateral trade relationship was not as fragile as Trump so often claimed. Thanks to updated provisions in the trade agreement, nearly 90% of Canada's exports to the United States had been exempted from general tariff rates. These protective measures were not the result of chance, they were the fruit of painstaking rounds of negotiation, including clear rules on the origin of goods, and strict commitments to regulatory compliance. While major economies such as Europe and Japan had to contend with sweeping tariffs, Canada already had a protective armor in place. This meant that however loud Trump's threats might sound, their actual impact was limited. Washington could still impose a few specific tariffs, but the bulk of Canadian exports to the United States remained shielded by the existing agreements. Ironically, the very structure of the deal Trump once praised so highly contained provisions that undercut the pressure he was trying to create. Even his closest advisors had to admit, the exemptions were exceptionally strong, even as Trump continued to present Canada as the weaker party. In reality, Carney had turned what Trump called his leverage into little more than an empty threat. Instead of responding with tough declarations, Canada chose careful preparation, ensuring that every scenario had been anticipated. As a result, no matter how forcefully Trump spoke, the actual damage was kept to a minimum. The contrast between the two leaders grew sharper. One thrived on bluster, on social media theatrics, issuing ultimatums for the cameras, while the other quietly pursued a strategy that was steady and grounded. Over time, Trump's so-called trade pressure looked less like negotiation and more like performance. His threats no longer rattled Ottawa, they became little more than echoes, loud but weightless. Canada chose its own path, forging new partnerships abroad, strengthening domestic capacity, and adapting proactively to external shocks. The more Washington tried to disrupt, the more Canada projected resilience. Each time Trump attempted to show force in order to make Ottawa retreat, Carney's resolve only grew stronger. He only highlighted the futility of trying to bend a country that had prepared meticulously and stood firmly on clear principles. From late-night posts to fiery speeches about unfair trade, nothing shifted Canada's course. Protective measures remained in place, the economy continued to grow steadily, and Canada's international standing was, in fact, elevated through this confrontation. Trump may have thought he was holding the spark to ignite Canada's economy, but he overlooked the fact that his counterpart already had the water hose, the smoke masks, and the evacuation plan ready long before. On top of this, Trump made no secret of his frustration with Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, a man he himself had appointed in his first term. What began as scattered criticism escalated into public pressure, with Trump repeatedly urging Powell to slash interest rates or resign. The latest twist came with Governor Adriana Cola announcing her departure, creating a vacancy Trump could exploit to install an ally. That vacancy could allow him to gradually reshape the leadership of the Federal Reserve, an institution designed to operate independently, free from partisan interference, while the media remained fixated on the noise of trade disputes. This quieter development carried the potential for far deeper consequences. Trump had already purged Democratic officials from committees, reshuffled senior staff, and targeted those behind economic reports he disliked. Beneath the surface of the public sparring, this was a silent but powerful restructuring, aimed at bringing economic levers back under White House control. Now, Trump's reach extends to the Federal Reserve itself. The issue is no longer about running the economy more effectively, but about securing the power to adjust monetary policy at will, and the risks of that extend far beyond America's borders. If the Fed were turned into an extension of political power, The consequences could shake global financial markets. In Ottawa, the warning signals have been clearly recognized. That is why Prime Minister Mark Carney's long-term strategy of expanding Canada's trade partnerships is not simply an act of national interest. It is a necessary line of defense against potential economic shocks that could come from across the border. While Trump is reshaping the US economy to serve his image and personal legacy, Carney has quietly been laying solid foundations for Canada's long-term economic strength. That stark contrast has already begun to define the entire landscape. Today, Trump's weakness in boasting about his economic achievements was exposed. When the latest employment data was released, the statistics for May and June were sharply revised, removing nearly 258,000 jobs from the official reports. May recorded only 19,000 new jobs, while June was even lower, just 14,000. These figures were far too modest, compared to the monthly average, which typically ranges from 100,000 to 200,000. Market reaction was swift. Financial indices slid throughout the day as investors began to grasp the true scale of job losses. Even Trump's closest advisors were forced to admit their policies were disrupting the labor market, making businesses hesitant to hire. The trade wars Trump launched, with the stated aim of reviving American manufacturing, ended up accelerating layoffs instead. For Trump, this collapse was not merely an economic setback, it was a painful political blow. He had believed he could pressure other countries into concessions, while keeping the US economy intact, but that belief was shattered by the hard numbers. Dismissing the director of the Bureau of Labor Statistics could not hide the truth. His tariff policies were harming the very American workers he had promised to protect. When a leader chooses to attack the messenger, instead of addressing the real problem, it is not a sign of control. It is a sign of disorientation. Canada, by contrast, did not shy away from grim numbers, nor attempt to twist reality. Prime Minister Mark Carney's method has been to confront challenges directly, plan clearly, and maintain a steady course. As the US labor market falters, Canada is gaining an edge, protected by strategic agreements and a diversified trade policy. This gap becomes even clearer when comparing the real-world impacts of tariff measures. Europe and Japan have recently agreed to trade deals with the United States, accepting a general tariff rate of 15% on most exports. But Canada's deal looks entirely different. With exemptions secured under CUSMA, nearly 90% of Canadian exports to the US are shielded from tariffs, even as Trump escalates his threats. While the EU and Japan face sweeping tariffs with immediate effect, Canada has an authentic economic shield, protecting the bulk of its trade. This is not the product of luck, but the outcome of careful, strategic, and painstaking negotiations. Carney does not trade sovereignty for short-term gains. He embedded key safeguards deep into the legal structure of the agreement. Carney's strategy did not rely on shock statements. Instead, he focused on strengthening core industries, ensuring security for workers, and building a trade system that could stand firm over the long term. The difference in approach reflected a difference in priorities. Trump acted on impulse and short-term political calculations. Carney made decisions based on the larger, long-term picture. Canadians, despite partisan differences, shared a common voice in supporting a style of leadership that placed national interest first, unshaken by outside pressure. Canada's foreign policy was crafted around the country's own needs and standing, not to appease American demands. It is precisely this independence that irritated Trump the most. He expected submission, and when it did not come, his only reaction was anger. Throughout this standoff, Trump underestimated the strength of persistence. He believed that constant pressure would exhaust his opponent into submission, but Carney chose the opposite path, holding steady until the storm passed, and only agreeing to sign a deal if it was truly worthwhile. This was not meaningless stubbornness. It was an understanding that a nation's right to self-determination, like a muscle, will weaken if not exercised. And in the current economic climate, the contrast between these two approaches has never been clearer. While the United States watched hundreds of thousands of jobs vanish under the weight of the trade war, Canadian industries held firm, thanks to existing trade agreements and the development of new international economic partnerships. Domestic manufacturing maintained its growth momentum. The Carney government actively sought out and expanded cooperation with countries eager to do business with Canada, turning global uncertainty into leverage for development. That is resilience, proven in practice, not just written on paper. Trump grew increasingly frustrated, as the tools he had once relied on, from tariffs, to public attacks, to market manipulation, proved far less effective against a Canada that had fully prepared itself. With nearly 90% of Canadian exports to the US shielded from tariffs, his latest threats rang hollow. Perhaps that is why, instead of deploying a clear strategy, Trump so often resorted to personal attacks whenever Canada was mentioned. What should have been a political win for Trump, a strong jobs report, ended up striking him painfully at center stage. Only 73,000 new jobs were created in July. Well below expectations. What made the blow even heavier was the revision of May and June figures, which wiped out an additional 258,000 jobs from the official record. For any advanced economy, such losses in a short span are a sign of deeper structural trouble. But for an administration that built its image on the story of growth, this was a devastating hit. Those numbers were not abstract data points. They represented households without income, skilled workers left idle, and local communities struggling as orders and demand dwindled. And the cause of this collapse is no mystery: the tariff war launched by Trump disrupted supply chains, spooked investors, and created an unstable environment that left businesses unwilling to hire. Instead of listening to experts, he brushed aside every warning, pursuing decisions driven more by ego than by long-term calculation. In Canada, that lesson was recognized early on. When your neighbor's house is on fire, the first priority is to make sure the flames don't spread to your own. Carney refused any deal that could put Canada's sovereignty or economic stability at risk. This was not arrogance, but the result of clear-eyed judgment and a deliberate preventive strategy. Now, as American workers struggle to find jobs and industries reel from constant policy shifts, Canadian businesses continue to produce, export, and compete. The contrast between the two approaches has never been clearer. Trump chased control and image. Carney chose protection and persistence. One path has led to mass unemployment and political crisis. The other has preserved stability and opened new opportunities for the people. Trump once promised to make America stronger, but reality is showing the opposite. Within just 2 months, more than 250,000 jobs have vanished from the system. Behind those numbers are hundreds of thousands of families cutting back on expenses, skilled workers forced to set aside their craft, and entire towns built on manufacturing now facing an uncertain future. All because one man chose to pursue the symbolism of power instead of a substantive plan. He ignored every recommendation, launching a tariff war driven by impulse and devoid of strategy. Mark Carney saw this crisis coming early. He did not rush, nor act on emotion. He waited, prepared, and reinforced the defenses to keep the turmoil from spilling across the northern border. Trump wanted Canada to sign a deal that was already a dead end, but Carney refused. Was that a reckless gamble or a sound decision? And as the US economy continues to struggle for balance, will Canada's strategy keep proving effective? Subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next analysis. Thank you for watching.